From Washington, D.C. to the Central Coast, this is Focus with Farr, where our representative in Washington hosts in-depth discussions of important issues of the day. And now, Congressman Sam Farr.
Welcome to another Focus with Farr. Today we have probably one of the best guests I've ever had because he's local, Ben Jealous. Ben grew up in Pacific Grove, went to York School, then went off to Columbia University, and I'm going to let him tell the rest of the story. But it's not often that the Monterey Peninsula produces somebody of such incredible stature that has reached his sort of national, if not international, recognition at such a young age, and coming from the Monterey Peninsula. It's really amazing to watch here in Washington, and more than that, very, very proud to have Ben Jealous here as the head of the NAACP, both as president and CEO. Ben just recently announced that he's going to be retiring, and I want to just spend some time with him and the issues of the day, and also how it might relate to our district, central part of California, that Ben knows so well. Welcome to Focus with Farr, Ben.
Thanks, Sam.
Well, tell me, I was looking at the stats when you announced that you were leaving, and I remember when you came to this job. At age 35, you were the youngest person to ever lead the 104-year-old civil rights institution. You have 1.3 million active members. That's up from 174,000. You've registered almost 500,000 new voters in just the last election. And you've expanded your donor base eightfold. And you've increased the revenue to $46 million last year. If you were a CEO of Fortune 500, you'd be making a lot of money now. And people are after you. You've grown up on the Monterey Peninsula and have some incredible family values and wonderful mom and dad. And tell me how you got motivated to get into the civil rights movement.
Well, I was given great opportunities to lead at a young age, take on responsibility, growing up back home. In PG, I think my first sort of volunteer gig, I was 9 years old. I was a docent at the Natural History Museum. When I was about 12, I became the youngest tour guide at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the youngest docent there. But that same year, when I was 13, Jesse Jackson started running for president. And my parents, who had been active in SNCC and in CORE, the old Congress of Racial Equality, my mom had grown up in the NAACP, I said to them that I wanted to be involved. My dad said, well, why don't you come with me to the meeting? And an old Democratic Party activist there, Martha, I forget Martha's last name, but you would know her, peace activist. She'd been a scientist back in the day. Said, well, we need somebody to organize the high school students. My dad said, well, then you better stand up because you're the only high school student here. and we went to work, and those activists, Sylvia Quarles, so many other people, ultimately Jerry Anderson, when we moved over to the Dukakis campaign, they taught me how to organize. They taught me how to get people to sign up and vote. Door to door. I mean,
registering voters.
We had about 8 high school students, and we signed up well over 1,000. I think it was actually more than 2,000 people to vote. We saw Jesse Jackson in our county go from 7th in the polls to go to 2nd in the polls. And as a young person, you got a real sense of the impact that you could make. Now, my first campaign experience, I was 5, hanging door knockers on your campaign. We have the photos to prove it. I can't say I recall. But that was the great thing about growing up there, is that people believed in young people. And if you stood up and you said, I want to help, whether you were 9 at the Natural History Museum or you were 13 at a campaign, they said, well, here you go. This is how you can help.
So this grassroots organizing, which I think has been so effective in making so many movements on the Monterey Peninsula, because I think it's small of the area, you get to know people, there's not a real hierarchy. But then you really got motivated when in high school. You were at York.
Yeah, so for me, look, when I was 17, I left and I moved to New York City. and went to school.
As a freshman at Columbia?
A freshman at Columbia University. And I went there planning on becoming just a raging capitalist. This is the feeder school for the top jobs on Wall Street. One of my heroes growing up was Alex P. Keaton on Family Ties. My grandmother had left me just a small amount of money, and I had invested it pretty well when I was in high school, and so I felt like perhaps I could make something of this. And I joined the crew team. And I'm riding on the subway. I had to get on the subway every morning about 4:30 a.m. And as soon as you cross 125th Street, you go from being below ground to being about 3 stories above ground. And you're looking right into the apartment buildings of terribly poor families living in gorgeous buildings that were built by very rich people 100 years ago, 120 years ago, but have become tenements. And you see their lives at 4:30 in the morning, and then on the way home from the boathouse, you would see them at 7 o'clock in the morning. And you would see, 6 kids waking up in the same bed. Or one family in one bedroom, 5, 6 people, and a second family in a second bedroom, and a third family in a third bedroom. And eventually you would notice that that was just one apartment.
It's fascinating because when I trained for the Peace Corps, I trained at Columbia University, lived at International House, and was trained by Mitch Ginsburg in the School of Social Work. And we were about 119th Street, which was Spanish Harlem at that time. And the same, coming from the Monterey Peninsula, you just don't see these things.
It just blew you away, right? Yeah. And so I quit the crew team, and I started a group called the Harlem Restoration Project Youth Corps that restored those tenements. And I had to fight with the university because the university said, look, we just don't let you guys go help people in their houses. They can come to campus. There's a drop-in center, but it's just not safe. In fact, Mr. Jealous, the buildings that you want to restore, well, 2/3 of the people two-thirds of the units in those buildings have at least one family member involved in the crack trade, and they don't even let civil servants go into those buildings without bulletproof vests. But I was young, and we just insisted. We said, look, then we won't go down there representing the university. We'll just go down there by ourselves, representing ourselves. But you really can't stop us from helping people if we want to help people. And Sam, the difference that we were able to make to get people to believe that they could actually turn their lives around, that they could come together, start paying. These are buildings that have been abandoned by the landlords. Nobody was paying rent, but they saw us fixing the units, and they started paying rent, which meant that they could get a loan because Reagan had gotten rid of all the grants to fix the roofs, and fix the wiring, and make them actually livable places. We started a free daycare clinic in the basement of the building, really on the storefront, on the ground level, and what had been an old numbers running basically bank. And before we could actually start the daycare, we had to rip out bulletproof glass and reinforced steel and take this place that had been basically a haven for criminals and turn it into a daycare center for kids. And in the middle of that, I found out that the last person to organize in that building, to engage tenants in that building, try to give them hope, they found in 5 different dumpsters. One person in 5 different dumpsters. Ooh. And at that point, I really didn't care because I was committed to those people. And I also knew that we had reached an understanding with the crack dealers in the building. This was the early 90s. There were real territorial battles going on in Harlem. But they also understood that we were there trying to make their and their neighbors' lives better and their kids' lives better. And so ultimately, they protected us. I was probably safest anywhere in Harlem in one of those buildings. And I would spend years of my life doing that. And that's where I really got the bug, if you will, for spending every bit of your life that you can helping other people. And now when I go down those, walk down West 125th Street, I still occasionally bump into people from those buildings, and they remember me. Not because they know me from TV, but because I still look basically like I looked 20 years ago. And we spent a lot of time together back then trying to make the neighborhood a better place.
Well, a lot of people don't know that you also got elected by the Black Student Union to be the president, and then ended up forming a strike, wasn't it?
Yeah, no. One of my chief mentors in life has been a guy named Jack Greenberg. He was the Number 2 at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund with Thurgood Marshall. He was his handpicked successor. He was also the dean of Columbia College when I showed up. That's why I went there. And he got me started in my career. He got me a job in the mailroom of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund when I was 18. But I got pulled out of the mailroom by the lawyers there and sent to work as an organizer in Harlem, where I ultimately would meet the person who would become my wife.
Leah.
Yeah, where Leah and I would meet as young organizers, because the lawyers saw the front page of the Metro section of the New York Times, and there was this big protest up at Columbia that was credited with convincing the university to keep its full need financial aid policy. And they said, Jealous, they came into the mailroom and said, Jealous, do you know anything about this? I said, actually, I organized it. I said, well, then we're getting you out of the mailroom today. And, it was funny. Back then in the early 90s.
That cost you, didn't it? With the university.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I was kicked out. We were the first students suspended in more than 20 years, or in almost 20 years. But the students who had been kicked out and had supported the students who were kicked out 20 years ago, people who were active in Students for a Democratic Society and the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement before that, picked up the phone and called me and said, look, we have jobs for you. What do you want to do? I wanted to go work for the AFL-CIO, and it really accelerated my career in this town, my career as a community organizer, even more than coming back and becoming a Rhodes Scholar and actually graduating the university as a Rhodes Scholar.
I think you're the only person I know from the Monterey Bay area that's been a Rhodes Scholar.
Well, when I got this,
who grew up there.
Yeah, when I got that honor, my father said a similar thing to me. He said, well, son, my definition of a Rhodes Scholar just changed. I said, well, what was it? He said, somebody I didn't know.
Oh, your dad, Fred Jealous, what a marvelous person he is.
Yeah, no, he's a good guy.
And your mom was an activist too. I mean,
my mom is the true activist in the family. I mean, when she was 14, she was a named plaintiff. Actually, I think probably starting at 12, she was a named plaintiff in a lawsuit to desegregate Western High School for girls in Baltimore, and they won. And in 1955, after the city resisted Brown for a year, she was on the front line desegregating that high school. In the summer, she, as if that wasn't stressful enough, she would go further south to Virginia and participate in very early sit-ins these are like in the mid to late 1950s, trying to force churches to desegregate and then come back to campus and do it all over again.
What brought your mom and dad to the Monterey Peninsula?
The fact that their marriage was against the law in 1966 in Baltimore, Maryland, where they were living. And they ultimately moved back to the university town where they had both gone to school in the Midwest and then looked for places that would be more tolerant. They ended up in San Diego first, which was not more tolerant. In fact, it was the hotbed of the John Birch Society. And so as they got to know the state, they realized that Monterey and Pacific Grove, Santa Cruz, our kind of Bay region was a more tolerant place.
Lucky for us. And lucky for you, yeah. So this success you've had with NAACP, I mean, is beyond anything. I knew you were going to be great, but I didn't know you were going to be just the greatest. You're one of the best leaders in this whole city of Washington because you're still committed to grassroots organizing.
Well, these are times for grassroots organizing, and the far right wing. It's kind of funny talking to a guy named Farr, but the extreme right wing, the extreme right wing has really made this a time to organize. And what they've done, Sam, is they've gone and they've attacked whole sets of groups of rights at the same time. Women's rights, the right to organize, clean air, clean water, voting rights, affirmative action, rights of people to reunite their families when they've come to this country, when they've migrated to this family.
Immigration.
Yeah, everything, right? And the strategy seemed to be, well, if we light all their houses on fire at once, if we attack comprehensive immigration reform, we attack voting rights, attack affirmative action, attack, that they'll balkanize. They'll all run back to their individual houses and try to put the fires out one by one, and they'll become more vulnerable and disorganized. We've done anything but. several years ago, a bunch of us who lead large membership organizations and who were trained as organizers came together. As the head of the Sierra Club, head of Greenpeace, head of Service Employees Union, and so forth, came together and said, our only option, the head of Planned Parenthood came in and said, our only option is to adopt the motto of the Three Musketeers and just say all for one and one for all. And so last year, for instance, in the state of Maryland, in 1 year, we passed the DREAM Act, we passed marriage equality, we passed sensible gun safety reform, we expanded voting rights, and we abolished the death penalty in one 12-month period.
That's remarkable.
And we were able to do that because people hung together, because people put all their chips on the table. In New York City, we just beat Mayor Bloomberg and passed a real anti-racial profiling ordinance with teeth. And it was, at the end of the day, it was because the Black, Latino, and Asian caucus and the LGBT caucus came together and stuck together. Even though Speaker Quinn, who was the most high-profile member of the LGBT caucus, broke with us, they all hung together. And at like 2 o'clock in the morning, when we're in the finally ending the legislative debate and passing the bill before we had to come back several weeks later to override the mayor's veto, a 60-year-old white gay member of the city council, one of the deans of the LGBT caucus, gets up and says, what they did to me when I was 16 years old, and the NYPD charged me with being a juvenile prostitute when I was nothing but a young gay kid hanging out in the village, was wrong then, and what they're doing to these young black kids is wrong now, and that's why I'm going to stick with those kids. We need more of that.
Yeah.
And it needs to cut both ways. And and that's why it was so important to me to be way out there on the marriage equality fight. My parents' marriage had been against the law. I know what it's like to grow up a kid of a marriage that much of society has rejected just as an idea. And if I could be helpful in helping our society move beyond this moment and get to a place where those kids are growing up in LGBT unions now can be fully accepted and not treated like, something less than I had to be part of that.
Well, you were so wonderful because our local communities were there a long time ago, and certainly our state of California, except for the heinous initiatives that have gone about to profiling and banning being anti-immigrant and anti-Hispanic and anti-gay. All those things are now turning upside down. But having said that, we're in a county, one of the rare counties in California, there's only 3 of them, that were affected by the Voting Rights Act under the fact that as you drew political lines, because of the low registration in Monterey County back in the 60s, we qualified as a county that had to be reviewed by the Justice Department. And the Supreme Court's just thrown that out. And it must be, you've worked so hard to make sure that these districts around the country, not just in California, but around the country, have been fair and equal in their reapportionment and fair and equal in being able to get access to the polls. This case is,
quite frankly,
where are we going to go from here?
Well, this is the one thing that I'm very optimistic that we can really get done in the House bipartisan this year. I think because Jim Sensenbrenner has stood up on the Republican side, and because Eric Cantor has actually extended an olive branch so that he's willing to try to figure something out, there's a possibility, right, that this House could, for a moment, remind the country that it can get something done, right? I can't imagine the frustration that you've had just in these past couple of years here, right? When you've seen so many of your colleagues just kind of dig in their heels, across the aisle, albeit, but nonetheless in this House, dig in their heels, right? And so this is the one time that I've had hope, looking at this House, that in the next 12 months, we can actually get a big piece of civil rights legislation through, despite the fact that it's a Republican Supreme Court that's created this crisis. I'm very I'm very hopeful on that. But the bottom line is voting rights has to be the most important issue for all of us as us. For any of us, it may be, it's probably not, right? It's probably education or healthcare or the environment. But you can't defend any of those things if you can't defend your right to vote.
Yeah, you can't defend a democracy. You can't participate in a modern world without transparency, access, ability to express yourself, and voting is the ultimate expression.
And look, as a kid who grew up in Monterey County, when Cesar Chavez was leading protests and Dolores Huerta was leading protests, I always understood that my county was pulled into the Voting Rights Act, not because it necessarily had oppressed blacks, but because of how they had oppressed Chicanos. And I think the beauty of Monterey County and the people of Monterey County is that a long time before it became fashionable in the rest of the country, people started to come together, inspired by Cesar Chavez, inspired by people like your father, who, and say, look, it's just up to us to build a better county. It's up to us to build a better state. But let's start right here. Let's be more tolerant right here. Let's create opportunities for kids regardless of their color right here. Let's be opening and accepting to LGBT families right here. The Pacific Grove I grew up in many ways was a place that was becoming a haven for people who didn't feel accepted where they were from, whether that was Brooklyn or Baltimore, where they were from. They just did not feel like their family could really flourish there. And I carry a piece of that with me wherever I go and when I do this work. And it's been the easiest thing, for instance, to help people decide that when we did the march from Selma to Montgomery last year, it was going to be against HB 56. It was going to focus on basically what was a Latino exclusion law, even though it would be a primarily black march. Because when I grew up, we learned about Martin Luther King from our parents and in books. But Cesar Chavez was on TV. And he was right over there in Salinas. And the UFW were our heroes. And if they were, boycotting grapes, we didn't eat grapes until like 3 years after the boycott was over. You know what I'm saying? The UFW said, don't do it. You just didn't do it. Until you were really, really sure it was okay. And I love grapes, but there were whole decades of my life, I'm sure I didn't eat a grape.
Well, you've been such a incredible student of social change and civil rights activism. You're now leaving. You're going to teach, and you also have this drive, which I think is so beautiful, that you really want to start raising money to get progressive candidates, to get particularly black candidates elected to office.
I want to see progressives win again in the Southeast. We can do it. When you look at the rising numbers of black voters, it's clear that that's the base in the Southeast. But when you look at what's happening, like even this, whether it's Michelle Nunn in Georgia or Wendy Davis in Texas, what's been going on with white women voters in the Southeast, there's real possibility. When you look at the increasing Latino numbers, not in the Southwest, but in the Southeast, places like Mississippi and Georgia, that accelerates the trend. And then the young group of white voters are simply less hung up on race than their grandparents and great-grandparents are beginning to pass on. And so, that's why the extreme right wing, I won't call them the far right wing anymore, the extreme right wing is fighting so desperately right now. Because they look not just at black people or Latinos or the women's vote, but they look at their own children and they say that the clock's running out on our brand of politics. This sort of divide and conquer stuff has a kind of inherently limited shelf life. Because most people in this country, the divide that they're worried about is the divide between the rich and the rest of us. Right? That's when you talk to young people, they're not so fixated on race. They're fixated on whether or not they can get a job, pay back their college debt,
huge debt.
Afford to buy a house, and when that's number one, well, then there are new possibilities to unite us across all those lines that used to divide us.
So, we only have a couple of minutes left. If you're summing it all up now, you've got 2 children. You have, how old's your daughter now?
My daughter's 7.5. My son Jack is 14 months.
Oh, congratulations. Those kids are growing fast.
Born on the 4th of July.
My birthday.
Yeah.
So, and I you know, I'm a grandfather now, and I look at you as in the younger generation, and I think I really envy your maturity in making. This is a tough decision. You're at the top of your game. You're a big person in this town and in this country.
Well, it's a tough decision, and it's a tough one to articulate in this town, because people in this town are so used to people using family as an excuse, you know, that they have a hard time believing it. But the person they don't know is Fred Jealous, right? They don't know my dad, who's been a feminist activist for 40 years, and who, when I was a kid, stopped working for 2 years, just so he could bond with his son from ages 2 to 4, and his daughter, who was about 7, like mine is now, till about 9. And while my father and I went back to kind of a cat's cradle, you know, type, you know, just like the song, he was very busy when I was young. I'm very busy now that he's older. We can still lean on the bond that we created, and I know that if I can't create that bond now with my kids, I'm just going to miss the opportunity.
Wow. Congratulations. Just a beautiful decision.
Thanks.
And you know, whatever you do, you're going to be really successful. We're always going to continue to be proud of you.
Well, you know what I'm actually really looking forward to is that my wife has now said that now that I will not be traveling so much, we can spend most of our summers back home in Monterey. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
We have a law school there, and she teaches constitutional law. So if you ever want to come back.
See if we can work something out.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm not going to be in Congress forever. I guess I should ask you this question. Are you interested in running for this congressional seat? Seems like everybody else in the district is.
Well, you know, I got to tell you, I'd be lying if you know, if I didn't say that I hadn't thought about it over my life. I started out in this town as Leon Panetta's page. But I hear that his son, Jimmy, is running. I hear that there's some other good folks who are running. And the one thing I'm certain is that our county will produce somebody who's like you, who's like Leon, you know, who is smart and capable and focused on the actual big solutions that we need for the country. I mean, I don't think I'll ever forget, Sam, being at President Obama's swearing in this last time.
Wasn't that something?
And, you know, you were there as our congressman, and Leon was there as the outgoing head of DOD, and before that CIA, and the commandant from the Marine Corps was talking Carmel High football. He
went to Carmel High School.
You know, and we're talking Carmel High football, and I bumped into the head of the JACL, who's also from our county. And, you know, one thing our county can be proud about is that it has consistently created a very diverse crop of world-class leaders who are absolutely, at the end of the day, committed to their hometown. And one thing we have in common, we all love that hometown, and we want to use that experience to build a better nation. Well, and that's the thing. Thanks, we're running out of time, and I just really appreciate you being on this program today. We look forward to your success. Thank you. Thank you for watching.
For more information, contact one of Congressman Farr's district offices. You can also reach Congressman Farr in Washington or visit his website.